Good afternoon, wherever you are out there. And we'll start up again. I want to first talk a little bit about that poll that we put out yesterday, which we had 2 questions, and I saw a lot of people had answered it. Let's just go over that. For those of you who didn't answer it, you go into, on Friday, it says Friday Recap. That's where you're going to find this polling, and actually for the polling for the rest of the day for Dr. Mullins, he's got some polling, this Friday Recap. That's what you're going to go to. So let's go to this first question, just see how you answered. So, there are several alternative therapies for the treatment of GERD. Dr. Mullin talked about a number. We just put a few up here, but I was curious as to what your experience is. So many people are familiar and have used melatonin. Slippery elm is obviously a botanical that's quite commonly used. Zinc L-carnosine, as Jerry talked about, has a number of research articles. So many of you, a third of you are thinking about or have used that. I would encourage you to look at some of that research because I think zinc L-carnitine can be very useful. And then for those of you who are chiropractors or DOs or do visceral manipulation, and there's, as Jerry said, there is some interesting and useful research on that as well. So let's go to the second one. This is one I was very curious about, what kind of dietary approach that is kind of the first line, and I think Liz did a nice job of segmenting and a flow chart of what we use or what we suggest. And for me, the elimination diet is the first line approach, first line therapeutic approach. Many of you, the other first line approach is a Mediterranean diet, so those kind of tied with diet, which is good. And then many of you are using a paleo approach. Some of you are using the Renew, which is one of, as Liz was talking about, which is a more a reset, as we like to say. So this is interesting and not surprising to me, the kind of dietary approaches you all are using primarily. So that's interesting and useful. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do a little team challenge. So I want you to get out your phones and go to that. Am I doing it right? Oh, good. So get out your phones, and this is a team challenge, team battle, team challenge. So you're going to the Friday Recap again. And as you go there, you'll see that there are, there's going to be 3 teams. You got to join this battle. So then there's 3 teams. So this is my left side. I get to choose. So you're the left side over here. So you should pick left side and then confirm. You're the right side over there. This is on the honor system. You're the right side. You're the left side. You are live streamers over there. I realize you could go into some other group. Don't do that. We know who you are. So you picked, and we're going to come to that first question, which is, as Dr. Mullin has talked about. So this is, now you're on left side, right side. So this is from Dr. Mullin. As you can see, he is a baseball aficionado. Which Met hit a ground ball to Bill Buckner of the Red Sox to end Game 6 of the 1986 World Series and made baseball history? Ray Knight, Lenny Dykstra, Gary Carter, or Mookie Wilson? This is for you millennials. You probably have no idea. I know the answer. Dr. Mullin knows the answer. Now, what are you playing for? You're playing for pride here. That's all you're playing for. You're not going to get a Starbucks card or anything. You're playing for pride. So, you've put in your answer. What is the correct answer? Mookie Wilson. If you don't know that, you should YouTube it. It's a very famous play in World Series history. Bill Buckner was actually the GOAT of that play, but he's actually had a great career. He actually died recently. He was an all-star. So let's see who won that. Who had the most correct answers? And this is a percentage, because we know that we know that the live streamers there are many more of them, but we're taking a percentage of the right answer. So the left side, all of you, I don't know how many of you, but you've won the first one so far. So now we're going to actually go into some clinical conundrum. So we'll go to malabsorption, vitamin A and malabsorption. So this is the second question. So what are signs and symptoms of vitamin A malabsorption? What do they include? They include microcytic anemia. What's the most important one that they would include? Follicular hyperkeratosis, leukonychia, or chelosis? Yes. So signs and symptoms of vitamin A malabsorption include, let's see who won this one. The answer is follicular hyperkeratosis. Who won? Oh my God, the left side won again. We'll go one more, just one more. What's the problem here? Is there sour grapes? What is the issue? So you can't get into the software? It's just you? Come on. All of you, none of you can get into the software? It's just the table, just that table? I think it's sour grapes. I'm gonna get Dimitri in here because you know, you saying that and that you didn't win kind of, it just makes me a little concerned there. So we'll go to one more question before we have Dr. Mullin come up here and save me. So we'll go to presidents and who was the first president that was on TV? So can we go to that one more question? Who was the first U.S. president to appear on television? This will get the millennials. Dwight Eisenhower, Harry S. Truman, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Adlai Stevenson. I hope somebody puts one of those who's not a president, who was never a president. Who wasn't a president? You don't even know, do you? Adlai Stevenson was never a president. That was a trick question. What is the correct answer? The correct answer, FDR. Let's see who won that one. Oh, see now you're not complaining, are you? It's 2-1. Those people out there, they're either asleep, I'm not sure what. We'll finish up this game after Dr. Mullin actually gives us some real clinical pearls. So, Dr. Mullin?
Well, that was interesting. So 2-1, what does that remind you of? The World Series, right, Diego? Because last night, the Houston Astros made a comeback and made Diego very, very happy. Although we're all, from the DC area, used to seeing some losing, and I'll just kind of keep it at that. Alrighty. So this morning, we're going to talk about something. We used to use the term fire in the gut as the title for the lecture, but I think we're just going to focus on treatment options for IBD. Now, one of you all approached me yesterday and said, you know, in Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are like these two different syndromes that behave differently. They may have some common pathophysiology root causation that we're going to focus on today. They get treated a little bit differently in the medical world, and we do have some differences to show you this morning in terms of outcomes with probiotics and prebiotics, etc. But I think just focus on root causation, pathophysiology, and treatment using the functional medicine model, and I think you'll make some big differences in people's lives. So with that, we will discuss the management. We're going to use the case-based approach that you all been used to in the last couple of days. Again, focusing on the ATMs and then following through individualized treatment protocols and giving you some evidence-based recommendations in the literature to go along with that. So here's the case. 34-year-old lady from the U.S. who was diagnosed with ileocolonic disease for her Crohn's, and Crohn's tends to most commonly involve the ileocecal region, right? It tends to involve the terminal ileum and the right side of the colon most commonly. Less commonly involves the small bowel alone, less commonly involves the large bowel alone. It tends to involve the region that centers around the ileocecal valve. And this lady remembers that her illness began after a vacation in Mexico, had travelers-induced diarrhea, which progressed until ultimately she was diagnosed with Crohn's. She now presents with a constellation of symptoms that are very concerning. She has a 25-pound weight loss, which for a young lady, that's incredibly concerning. Arthritis, rectal urgency, diarrhea, so on and so forth. So I think from there you can, gather that there is some red flag symptomatology. Malabsorption is quite possible in someone with that type of weight loss. And with Crohn's disease, that can involve the small bowel. You can start imagining, particularly the end of the small bowel, and knowing what's absorbed or what can be malabsorbed there. You can start asking yourself questions about, what are the kind of things that you'd want to look for on a metabolic panel, and come to some of the disruptors of absorption of her fatty acids and B12 and things like that. So these are the kind of things that I would think about after hearing those kind of things from the beginning in the case. So she does note fatigue, just like you would expect for someone who's lost 25 pounds. High levels of stress at home and work, which certainly do not help. Now, Dan had mentioned, and I believe Patrick had mentioned as well, is that we do see a number of conditions where there's family histories. And we know that with celiac disease, that there's a family history, there's more increased prevalence of celiac disease in families, the same is true as Crohn's. There has been studies looking at permeability in relatives of individuals with Crohn's. So if you have, does anybody here have a family history of Crohn's? One person, because for those who do, that there's at least immediate, first-degree relatives, their permeabilities have been found to be increased in some studies. So that's maybe part of the predisposing factor in addition to the genetics, right? So the medication she's on at that point in time, she's on mesalamine, and this is, certainly around the time what they call top-down therapy. You all familiar with what top-down therapy is? You are? Okay. Well, for those who aren't, it's where you it's kind of an overkill phenomenon where you just give biologics, to people with mild, moderate symptoms, and that'll certainly get them under control. But the question is, there's a dependency that develops over a period of time. It's hard to get off, and it may not be necessary for all. But the top-down therapy is a marketing scheme from the makers of the biologics, so therefore more docs would give biologics. And although that there may be some better outcomes that are associated with that, of course the outcomes are much better for the pharmaceutical firms who make it, but for some of the patients with more aggressive disease, it gets them under control. The question is it necessary for everybody? Just like everybody on Earth was once felt to have a PPI deficiency, and then we know what that marketing scheme has led to. Okay. With that, she was on the typical American diet, married, 2 young children, stressful lifestyle at home, very centered, very spiritual. On exam, she presents, as you can see, she is 5 foot with only 90 pounds. And guarding on exam in the right lower quadrant is where you would expect someone with ileocolonic disease to really experience their pain in the ileocolonic region. So we go back and we say, well, look, how are we going to evaluate this individual? Again, we go into this gathering mode. We're getting some data together. You're getting some ideas at this point based on the history and the exam, what you would do in terms of ordering different biomarkers and different tests to try to get a little more pinpoint in terms of her disease activity. And then you can move forward and down the rest of the matrix and go into more of a go-to-it mode here. So this is the point I was making, is that if you look in terms of the most lucrative medications that are out on the market, you can see number one being a biologic, and it's kind of follows suit from down to 3 to 5, is that these biologicals are very expensive and they're being used widespread. In fact, they can become profit centers for individuals who run infusion centers as well. And so it's a matter of how the dose is the poison. So in this situation, is top-down therapy necessary for everyone with this particular disease? So what would you do to evaluate her case? Then you have some data. You have some hard data that she's vitamin D deficient, which is not surprising since many people, particularly this part of the year moving forward in the winter, are going to be vitamin D deficient in North America. But she's quite deficient, and she has a number of reasons why she would be deficient, and you'll see some epidemiological evidence moving forward how being vitamin D deficient is a risk factor, sort of speaking, for Crohn's disease, and how amelioration in the protocol for vitamin D can actually make a difference. Vitamin A is low, and Dan had mentioned through the polling what some of the manifestations are. What about vitamin A toxicity? What would be well, maybe you can interact with me and give me some symptoms and or signs of vitamin A toxicity, because we do have people who OD on vitamin A, and actually it can cause liver fibrosis, so it can be quite serious. So, vitamin A is something you don't want to definitely take too much of. So, have you seen people who are taking too much vitamin A? No? Gentlemen, what have you seen? Pardon me? Okay, jaundice from the liver. Okay, but any other, like, classic signs, too, that, how about the bone? How about bone pain? Periostosis. People can get bone pain and actually bone disease from high vitamin A. So it's something you may want to keep in check in terms of when you counsel people. You may want to keep an eye, and there's people who really want to take tens of thousands of units a day. It's just not something you want to do. So, but she's got a low vitamin A. Her stool analysis, she's got low butyrate, which may be an opportunity, right? Because butyrate is protective. We'll talk about what butyrate does to the gut, particularly the colon. It's an energy source, as Patrick mentioned, but it's anti-inflammatory, anti-neoplastic, and it's important for the permeability or the integrity I spoke about on day one, right? We talk about, we always focus on small bowel barrier and leaky gut, but also the colon is part of the gut, and integrity is important as well. Her stool analysis was low for beta-glucuronidase, but that's the enzyme that Patrick really eloquently discussed yesterday, is that when it's elevated, then that's more of a concern. And we'll go through that mechanism a little bit diagrammatically in an algorithm that Patrick had discussed yesterday, but you keep it in mind, particularly for all of you who do biotransformation for the rest of the weekend. So her stool analysis showed fat droplets. So there we have hard data that there is fat malabsorption. So in somebody who's lost 25 pounds, it's not a surprise, right? Because fats are high in energy. You're malabsorbing fat, you're going to subsequently lose weight. And although her vitamin K is high, and that kind of like is one of these, little pearls that she may have a dysbiosis from manufacturing the vitamin K from having a bacterial overgrowth, she's not certainly malabsorbing enough to be deficient. She's making her vitamin K, but the fat-soluble vitamin A is low, D is low, and it would be not surprising if vitamin E is low as well, okay? And then you look at her stool analysis, she's got protein fermentation byproducts that are elevated, and then in the setting of dysbiosis, that would not be surprising. So that's kind of like the way I would look at these data moving forward, although I know the case. So it's kind of cheating a little bit, but if I had to hear these data, this is the kind of way I would analyze it moving forward. Do we have a radiologist in the audience? There's usually always one, but not today. Okay. So what you're seeing here is a radiograph showing that there is thickening, you can see here, in the end of the small bowel. So she's got really active ileocolonic Crohn's disease, shown on CAT scan. Although her fecal elastase is okay, Here they show greater than 500 is quite good. Breakdown of the protein byproducts, right? You're looking at valerate, isovalerate, and isobutyrate being high. So she's got putrefactive short-chain fatty acids, malabsorbing fat. So you're getting a sense that she's got serious trouble. Likely dysbiosis is really part and parcel with what we're seeing going on here. Not surprising in someone with active Crohn's disease that there is hyperpermeability, right? Look at the lactulose recovery. So you're having all these bigger particles going right between the cells. Okay, surprising that the mannitol is as good as it is, so her cells are not complete. Her enterocytes are intact, relatively speaking, but given that her disease is localized to the end of the small bowels, again, most of the absorption is occurring proximally, at least she's able to absorb some of her nutrients through her enterocytes, which is actually probably keeping her alive at this point and off TPN. You can see the butyrate is low, right? The short-chain fatty acid is low, and certainly we can optimize that with prebiotics. Beta-glucuronidase is low, but we're going to discuss why that may be a issue to look at, particularly if it's induced. And without giving you more information, we're going to do a poll. We're going to make this a little more interactive. And I'm going to let Trevor take it away. Alrighty, so let's look quickly back at the case on slides 4 and 5. And we want to populate the matrix. So which of the following three items would you consider to be the three most important triggers for this case? Would it be high stress? Relative with Crohn's, we talked about where that may be a risk factor. Long use of history of antibiotic use, which I overlooked to mention. Would it be a long history of the Western diet? A prior cholecystectomy? Right? Or travel-related illness. And these are all in play, by the way, so you can't really go wrong, but it's just a matter of, for you all in the audience and for you all at home, what do you think about what's driving all this? So we have high stress, and I think that's good to keep in mind for all of our GI illnesses, knowing that the enteric nervous system can definitely be disrupted and a driver of illness. Antibiotic use, because we have somebody who has a dysbiosis, who had a travel history to Mexico and got sick, bless you, might have been susceptible from the antibiotic use to begin with. Having a prior cholecystectomy in somebody with diarrhea could also be in play, but realize that in Crohn's disease, you tend to form what happens if we have malabsorption of long-chain fatty acids is that you saponify fats. And usually what happens with calcium oxalate, right, is that you have two things going on. One, you have the free absorption of oxalate because calcium's being bound by the long-chain fats that are malabsorbed. That oxalate can cause kidney stones. So in this population, you can see a higher prevalence of kidney stones. And in the setting of deconjugation of bile acids that I'll talk more about in this case, you're going to have a depletion of the bile acid pool. You're going to have disruption of enterohepatic circulation of bile acids because of terminal ileal disease. And there'll be a higher predisposition to gallstones. So it's not surprising that individuals with Crohn's disease that involve the terminal ileum will have a higher prevalence of gallstones. Got to get at least one sip in, right? It's too bad we can't do a word cloud and ask the folks who are live streaming what's on my tie. We've had people out in headquarters think it was cheetahs. We've had other comments, I believe, that said they were little coffee beans because of my talking about coffee every day. But too bad we can't do a word cloud to let you know what's on my tie today, because at least back in the corner there was several jokes relatable to that. But the answer is it's just a paisley, as everybody can see today. There's nothing really magical about it. It may look cool at home, and yeah, okay, fine, but it's not coffee beans, no. I restrict my coffee. I don't even do commodities in coffee. Even though it's up, I would make a mint, I guess, if I did. But in any event, Trevor, before I say something more stupid, go ahead. Alrighty. I am in New York, are we going to do? Our patient's test results show high fecal fat. What are the likely causes of fat malabsorption? Is it SIBO? I've been dropping hints. Mucosal disease. Definitely I've been dropping hints. Pancreatic insufficiency. Interesting. Bile acid insufficiency. The way that was put, Dan, that is interesting. And they're off. So the vast majority of the audience feel bile acid insufficiency, which is in play. I would call it deconjugation of bile acids, and if they're deconjugated and they're not doing their job, I would call that a bile acid insufficiency. The individual had a normal pancreatic elastase, so I don't think it's that. Mucosal disease, we saw the CAT scan, right? And SIBO, we haven't proven that yet, but it's definitely SIBO on my mind, right? I mean, SIBO is always in play. He got the joke. I'm glad you liked it. Anyway, if I said Georgia on my mind, then well, it's different. Maybe for Diego, it's Houston on my mind after winning the game last night. Let's see. So next, what is the relevance of low beta-glucuronidase in our patient? It is typically low in inflammatory bowel disease. It is induced, I guess the enzyme is induced by probiotics. It is downregulated by omega-6 fatty acids. Interesting. It is upregulated by dysbiosis. Just realize that there's only one correct answer here. So if you feel that one is the most correct answer, I would go with that. And they're off. Okay. So most of you feel that it's typically low in inflammatory bowel disease. There is no particular affiliation with inflammatory bowel disease as an entity itself. Probiotics actually do not induce it. It does the opposite. It downregulates it. Likewise, for omega-6 fatty acids, it would upregulate it, not downregulate it. And in dysbiosis, that would be the root cause of upregulation. And when you have beta-glucuronidase, more of that, then you're uncoupling the detoxified xenobiotic like estrogen, and then you would have more of these xenobiotics in your system. And as Patrick mentioned yesterday, he talked about colorectal cancer and breast cancer being at higher risk from having an induction of beta-glucuronidase, and the way to treat that, we'll talk about that in upcoming slides. So I think we're done here, Trevor. I can grab control. And so, again, one of the, and you'll learn this in much more detail in the next module, but certainly it's the way by which we detoxify or biotransform these xenobiotics. And certainly phase 2, glucuronidation, is very important for that. And so what we know is that the bacteria in the gut, some of them, can break this bond and then free toxin for reabsorption. So again, we have glucuronidation. Let's say estrogen being an example that Patrick mentioned yesterday. You can have conjugated estrogen in bile, excreted in the stool, but in the setting of this enzyme, which is induced by the gut bacteria, you can then cleave this this conjugation byproduct and allow for reabsorption in the circulation. So what do you do? So what do you do when you have that? Is that to try to downregulate that enzyme that has been induced, you can give calcium D-glutarate to do that. And that can inhibit your beta-glucuronidase. That would be the way to do it. This is a really nice slide that puts it together, courtesy of Kirsten. Thank you very much for that. Then Dan, in the question that he constructed, talked about the pre and probiotics and the effects on beta-glucuronidase. So what you're looking to do in this situation is attenuate, not induce. And you can see here about how these particular strains have been found to attenuate the activity of beta-glucuronidase, that the LKCI Shirota and B. breve have been shown to downregulate, and as well as oligofructose-enriched inulin and lactulose. Lactulose, we talk about breath testing, and you can look at it for permeability, but also it's a prebiotic. So back in the day, When people used to have hepatic encephalopathy and they got lactulose because its prebiotic effect, and it helped improve the dysbiosis in people with cirrhosis and encephalopathy, and that's how it improved it, as being not only a cathartic, but also a prebiotic, which is kind of interesting. So realize that although we can give a supplement for calcium D-glutarate, it's also available in certain foods in a very limited quantity. You want to look in the 1 to 200 milligram range to do that, and certainly you're getting very little of that in foods, but realize that some foods have glutarate in it. This shows you a little bit more about what we're looking at in the stool, and I just circle some things that are of interest. And as Patrick had mentioned yesterday, it's not so much to pinpoint maybe some organisms, it's to look at the community, and it's the way the communities are interacting with each other. Here, just for the education purposes, I do circle the Akers-Mania muci, which Patrick had mentioned several times, is protective. It helps with the mucin layer, and if the mucin layer is compromised, then you can have more invasion through the biofilm with different pathogenic organisms, barrier breakdown, endotoxemia, and inflammation, so on and so forth. Methanobacter brevi smithii, in this case, is felt by some to be protective, which is within, with normal limits here. You can see the bifidobacteria is not so horrible, and lactobacillus species, so on and so forth. So there's really nothing outstanding, but when you do additional bacteria analysis, there are some pathogens that are in play, and also Candida. Now, as much as Patrick had mentioned about Candida being commensal, at least in limited quantities, in IBD, though, particularly in Crohn's, there are some questions about the participations of the mycobiome of certain fungi. And here, at least I have to say, let me go backwards, is that at least in our lab, we do speciate fungi, and it's hard to get done on the outside. In speaking to our laboratory, they do send out the Quest, and Quest can do this. So keep that in mind, is that if you send your stools for fungi to Quest, they can speciate for you. Okay. So on the left, and this particular slide shows you the dysbiosis that is occurring in individuals with IBD, and how on the right this can become quite disruptive. So you have more mucolytic bacteria, so we have less of that Akers-Mania muci to be protective, increase in the pathogenic bacteria, and this can disrupt not only the mucus layer, but also can disrupt the regulatory network that we have of immune cells that help keep things into balance. And then when that regulation becomes imbalanced and you have a Th1, Th17 driven inflammatory process that becomes autoimmune in nature, it can of course cause a lot of damage and permeability issues and so on and so forth. So, there is emerging data, as I mentioned, about the role of the mycobiome or the fungal ecosystem in terms of its ability to drive disease forward. And in fact, one of the ways that we help diagnose Crohn's is by antibodies to Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So we know that for many years that individuals with Crohn's can have elevations of these antibodies. It is not surprising that the new analyses of the microbiome show that there may be some association or some causality involved. Of course, a lower biodiversity is not unexpected for this individual in the setting of dysbiosis. And as you all who were polling before, who said we suspect SIBO, this shows you, and just to reiterate how we read breath tests, is that we like to have baselines of hydrogen 10 or below to be acceptable. So this person has a high baseline. The two possibilities would be: one, non-compliance with the diet, or two, the person generally has SIBO. In this case, I would believe the latter. You give a sugar challenge, whether that be lactulose or glucose, and by 90 minutes or so, you can see that there is an elevation greater than 20 parts per million above baseline. So you would subtract either 38 or 51 from 11, and you would certainly get more than 20 parts per million. And generally, there used to be a rule. You used to see a double peak: first peak in the small bowel, second peak in the colon. That's no longer a necessary criterion for breath testing. In terms of inflammation and immune, you can see the calprotectin is elevated. Patrick had mentioned in detail how calprotectin can be used as a tool to really point us towards that there is a gut inflammatory process, particularly in the colon, that may be operative. Eosinophil protein X as well is elevated, as well as fecal secretory IgA that Patrick had discussed during the Q&A yesterday. And a red flag here is the fact that the serum prealbumin, which has a short half-life of 3 days, albumin's got a half-life of 2 weeks. And so this really is an indicator of inflammation, that in the inflammatory process, it suppresses the liver's ability to make albumin, and prealbumin being a shorter half-life, showing more acuity. And also with the ferritin being sky high as an inflammatory marker, you can imagine how much inflammation must be happening here, unfortunately, with this individual. So let's do the case evaluation. This is called the dig-in model, digestion, right? So we're looking at that under the D, that she's got low 25-hydroxy vitamin D, and she's malabsorbing fat. Certainly, further analysis show that she's got a very tilted omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio. Not surprising given the standard American diet that's being consumed. And we looked at intestinal permeability. She has a leaky gut. We saw how bad the lactulose was in terms of being absorbed, right? And then G, certainly she has dysbiosis. Then we look at inflammation. We can see that the CRP of 67 is very high. She has evidence on her CAT scan of small bowel thickening. It looks quite inflamed. She's got certainly fecal calprotectin that's elevated. She's got what we call pus in the stools, or fecal leukocytes that are elevated, and a low butyrate in terms of a neurological imbalance. She definitely has high stress, which are not helpful. So again, using the matrix, trying to put this together, you can see again the ATMs to the left. It flows down from the American diet, family history of IBD, altered flora, triggering events, certainly long-standing antibiotics, travelers associated diarrhea, which is a common trigger for IBD and IBSD, and perpetuators being numerous, but at least focused here is inflammatory mediators, dysbiosis, and nutritional influences. If you look in the circle, mental, emotional, certainly a lot going on in her life. And then you could see around the core components from an energy point of view, she is fatigued. She has challenges with biotransformation. Certainly her defense and repair is compromised in a setting of dysbiosis and inflammation. And she does have reactive arthritis as well. So you can see that from this matrix point of view, this is someone who really needs a very aggressive approach. One step at a time, though, in our situation. So let's focus a little bit more on the ATMs and discuss more pathophysiology so we can understand better what is operative in her. So we know that IBD in this Venn diagram shows, with IBD being in the middle, all these different factors that are operative. So we know that in the setting of dysbiosis, that luminal antigens from dietary ingestion of food, but also the byproducts of the gut microbiome are certainly in play, and they become environmental triggers. There's genetics, there's clear genetic studies that I'll show you that make us predisposed as antecedents for this disease, and the way the immune responds as well can be genetically predisposed, or it can become a dysregulated event. So here, this slide that I put together from many years ago, I saw this published by Baldessano and then tweaked it a bit, shows that we have initiating events. Certainly NSAIDs can be an initiating event for somebody with IBD. Somebody with IBD who is taking an NSAID can actually trigger disease. So unfortunately, we have a number of patients who are in pain and take NSAIDs for the pain, but they're actually triggering their disease. Antibiotics will show you more data on antibiotics moving forward. Certainly, all types of microbial infections can be triggers. But at the end of the day is that when you have this reactive enteropathy, you can have translocation of luminal contents, whether endotoxin, bacterial byproducts, or poorly digested luminal antigens from food. It can trigger an immune response that can be initially reactive, or it can be dysregulated and become chronic and autoimmune. And then in the setting of this chronic inflammatory process that is set in, you can have a number of things that perpetuate this into an autoimmune, self-fulfilling vicious cycle. This talks about more environmental factors. You can see high up on the right that certainly we have looked at a number of factors. We know that the Western diet, and I'll show you some more data from the Nurses' Health Study at Harvard and by others that look at the typical Western diet components, sugars and fats and red meats, although red meats now is a little more controversial by contradictory data at a pen. But we have infections, antibiotics, as we mentioned in this case, cigarette smoking, which is a very known a risk factor for Crohn's, and for those who are on biologics, it can interfere with the activity of the biologic or effectiveness of the biologic. We talked about NSAIDs and stress, and certainly with the hygiene hypothesis, it's interesting that that could be a predisposing factor as well. We look at susceptibility genes. One of the individuals on the project, which had helped articulate the genes, we talked about NOD2 the other day. Patrick had one of the investigators was at Hopkins who did this work in collaboration with many others like Judy Cho. But there's a number of different genes that have been associated with susceptibility to Crohn's and has prognostic outcomes, such as NOD2. Epigenetic regulation can occur at many levels through the environment and through genetics in combination. The microbiome becomes a player in terms of kind of a balancing these different environmental factors, and itself can, turn in terms of being a factor itself, and then certainly innate and adaptive immunity become dysregulated, and we see what we call IBD. But so how does that dysbiosis interplay with IBD? Well, the things we can control is our food. So up until recently, there's abundant data show how red meat intake is a risk factor for this condition, and it's no surprising between the saturated fats and the enriched omega-3 fatty acids, omega-6 fatty acids, that the red meat would be a contributor towards this inflammatory process. We can attenuate it certainly with omega-3 rich foods. Gluten may be a factor in all this. We're not really sure. Saturated fats, artificial sweeteners. There is data showing that artificial sweeteners can disrupt the microbiome. And actually, since people use artificial sweeteners to try to improve diabetes and decrease caloric load, it actually can worsen glycemic balance and make one more susceptible to dysregulation of glycemia, paradoxically. So it may have a role in terms of its effect on the gut microbiome. We'll talk about certainly emulsifiers and carrageenan moving forward, because that may also be playing a role as well. So here, as I mentioned, this individual is on the standard American Western diet, which is higher in red meat and processed foods. We find sugars. Certainly, we've seen more emerging data and studies on the Mediterranean or an anti-inflammatory diet. There is a large study being conducted on the SCD diet and the Mediterranean or anti-inflammatory diet through the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation that is ongoing. But realize is that in this situation, we're looking to really improve barrier function, diversify the microbiome, and try to rebalance this disrupted immune response. Whereas in the setting on the right, we do drive the response moving forward. So this next two slides are very recent. They just came out within the last month, looking really through 53 meta-analyses. It's like a super meta-analysis in the field. It's very difficult to do, a mega meta-analysis. But in any event, so they looked at the different risk factors in IBD, and it's interesting that appendectomy would be one of those risk factors, because it's well known for ulcerative colitis. urban living, smoking at the top of the list. So for those with Crohn's disease, it's one of the first things we try to recommend is to come off tobacco use, and that can be quite challenging for some people. Believe it or not, tonsillectomy came up as a red flag. Antibiotic use, that's not a surprise. Contraceptive use, soft drinks, which are not so soft on the body, I guess, and vitamin D deficiency will tease this out. Helicobacter pylori infection is kind of a controversy, whether it is a risk factor or not, but at least with these non-H. pylori enterohepatic species, there's some studies showing that it's increased, while H. pylori itself is decreased, and maybe it's more about the fact that in areas of the world where we see a lot of H. pylori, we don't see a lot of IBD, but maybe that's just an association rather than a causal relationship. Certainly physical activity helps prevent this disease, and that's important to keep in mind in terms of lifestyle. Tea consumption is not surprising because teas are rich with phytonutrients, right? High levels of folate, breastfeeding, the bed sharing, I will not touch. What am I going to say? I can get, no matter what I say, I'm going to get in trouble, right? I'm used to getting in trouble. But anyway, you're not surprised about that, right? So, teach your children well. It's one of, besides Crosby, Stills, and Nash, Patrick likes showing these kind of slides with teach your children well in terms of teaching the immune system. But here it shows you that the number of courses, you can see it's very linear, that the more antibiotics you give to a child, the higher the risk of developing inflammatory bowel disease. That's startling. So yesterday we talked about PPIs in infants. It's up fourfold over the last decade, and the risk of fractures has gone up. I had an orthopedist in the audience come up to me and saying, we're seeing so many fractures with PPI use. And what do I tell my partners? What do I tell the people who are referring to me that you got to get them off the PPIs because you're responsible for this? That's kind of a hard situation to be in, but here with antibiotics. This really helped, Marty Blazer and his efforts to show that we're overprescribing antibiotics. And we're actually, we're going the other way with this. And we're actually causing disease more than preventing disease, unfortunately. But in any event, again, more and more about early life exposure. So I mentioned about the history of breastfeeding being beneficial, but even more so to the point if when Crohn's disease, it's inversely related with a subtype of aggressiveness, stricturing disease, fissuring disease. So if you're smoking, you're going to see more of this type of disease. If you're breastfeeding, you're less going to see this subtype of disease, less aggressive disease. So there is something clearly to it. Was that to tell you about the World Series score last night, Diego? Your bookie? What's the line for tonight? Huh? Okay, well I'll go with Washington still. How's that? But if they lose, then I'll have to go pay you a visit and buy you a drink down in Florida. Okay. Anyway, what's the role of stress? You can tell that there's a number of ways by which stress may be activation in terms of inflammatory. We know that in the setting of stress, that we talked about marathon running, but with stress there is hyperpermeability as well. So in the setting of stress, there's dysbiosis, permeability, and that certainly doesn't help individuals who have active Crohn's disease, does it? Okay, so now we've kind of given you some background data, some literature, so the question is, how are we going to move forward into a treatment plan? So we have this 5R mnemonic, right? We're going to remove the things that are bad, and in this case, there's a lot to work on. Replace. We saw, some of the data in terms of the microbiome, and reinoculate. There's a lot to repair here. She's got a lot of inflammatory disease and a terminal ileal enteropathy. And then the rebalance part, she's going to need to work on, herself in terms of her lifestyle and, mental emotional state. So how do we cool inflammation in the gut? So we can remove the triggers using food as medicine. We can reinoculate with pre and probiotics. And we'll show you some of the evidence for some of these different species with probiotics and inflammatory bowel disease. Anti-inflammatory nutraceuticals and the rebalance as well. And actually I have a colleague out in Germany who runs an integrative medicine center and has done some of that work in inflammatory bowel disease and has done systematic reviews, and I'll show you some of his data in a few moments. So, moving forward, again, removing the triggers. You saw some data. Again, we saw data yesterday. Liz had presented this about the elimination diet, about the elemental diet. She talked about SIBO and how Mark Pimentel uses a elimination diet. There's Alison Seitbecker who recommends an altered elimination diet. I'll show you data where there is a altered polymeric diet for this disease that works quite well. Botanicals, removed medications like NSAIDs can be detrimental by causing leaky gut and some immunological phenomenon that NSAIDs may be doing. And of course, remove those dietary factors. So this may be a little bit difficult to read, but it really shows you in this dietary review that we had published with the Cochrane review. The Cochrane collaboration, you familiar with the Cochrane collaboration? It's this large international network of investigators who do systematic analysis of literature to see if there is truth and or underlying message, putting very strict criterion in terms of how we test these different randomized trials. You need to have a randomized trial. They're certainly favored over cohort analysis. And so at Berkeley, Lamikai, who was a fellow at Hopkins, and then eventually earned a master's and then a PhD in epidemiology, and then went to Stanford to begin his career as a faculty member, and he's an IBD nutrition expert, and now he's at UCLA as an associate professor doing that kind of work. And he and I and others, a medallion award-winning nutritionist, Laura Matarese, and an IBD expert, Alyssa Parian, and then others from the UK who were involved in the Cochrane collaboration with Dr. McDonald, who didn't want to be on the paper because he's like an overseer of the GI Cochrane collaboration internationally, but he was certainly a big help. And so this was a 2 to 3 year project to go through the world's literature. And the caveat is it was randomized controlled trials. And in the diet literature, that is very hard to do. And then you're looking at very few studies in that situation. So the message was that we couldn't really have a message to show, is that there was insufficient evidence to show that there was any typical dietary intervention that had a statistical relevance, but there are individual studies that are quite interesting. And I'll show that to you in the next few minutes. So here, as you can see, that years ago there was not much of an interest in terms of diet and IBD, to the point now that if you look on clinicaltrials.gov, you will see a handful of different dietary interventions that are being used and analyzed, including those 2 studies that are from the CCFA, or the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. Now I've been honored by being picked as one of the reviewers for different dietary studies in IBD, along with 3 or 4 other investigators around the country. So now there's so many different submissions that they need a think tank to take a look at these studies. But in any event, you can see that there is growing literature of diet and IBD. Certainly, you can look for new targets, but if the primary reason is to improve lives, avoid surgery, and keep people in remission once they achieve remission. This is by work from published in the World Journal. Look at the different dietary factors that can impart risk, and risk is really key here, because we know that on the left-hand side, if we have a good whole foods-based diet, that actually epidemiologically, that's common sense to all of us, but it has a very strong foundation in the literature. And then to the right, the Western diet that this individual is on, showing these are risk factors for driving the disease moving forward. This is from our study again in the Cochrane review. We're looking at diets both to induce and to maintain remission. And so what you want to do in terms of the relative risk estimate is try to keep to the left of 1. And you can see here that symptom-guided diet actually didn't do so bad, because it just barely crossed 1, least one of the confidence intervals, and it was 0.53, but there was only 2 studies in 98 people, so it's very hard to draw firm conclusions. But that looked good. But also, I thought interesting was the exclusion diet. In some studies, where it was quite strong, but because there was such high variability and such few sample sizes, again, it was very hard to draw conclusions. But it kind of gives you the idea by exclusion diets that you can actually, reduce symptoms. To maintain remission was a little bit more difficult. And I think if you look at the risk estimate, there may be roles for pretty much most of these, but again, there's very few sample sizes. And again, you can see that there's wide heterogeneity, and that really kills the outcome in terms of being able to have any confidence. And the studies, the quality of studies that were executed were kind of low. That's why you're seeing these funded studies with large sample sizes and high grade in terms of their conduction, and they will certainly supersede our meta-analyses, because basically a large controlled trial can supersede a meta-analysis if it's done well. And that would be level A evidence. That's why those 2 studies are very important. They're multinational. I mean, in our geography, UPenn is probably the closest in the Mid-Atlantic, Northeast area to doing this. Jamie Lewis is one of the investigators. But then even what is going on in the diet that may be such a factor here is that omega-3 fatty acid balance has been long showed to be an important factor. If you're omega-6 pro-inflammatory rich, that's going to be a risk factor for this disease, and it'll provide an opportunity to give omega-3 fatty acids to help really mitigate the inflammation in the disease itself. Dietary fibers as prebiotics and anti-inflammatory nutrients. Again, we find that there are risk factors if you're deficient or if you have decreased prebiotic whole foods in one's diet. Vitamin D is a risk. We talked about omega-6 fatty acids. Alcohol intake or dietary iron intake had no associations either way. So this is an interesting slide by Ari Levine, who conducted a study out in Israel. And so this is what he sees as how the microbiome may interact with diet in terms of portending towards IBD. So he looks at the pathobionts or the different pathogens. He looks at the metabolome. Patrick had mentioned yesterday how the metabolome is this kind of like overarching way of looking at the way the gut environment may drive disease. And then here, oops, I keep on getting the buttons mixed up. But here you can see that we have different factors that actually may drive the metabolome adversely in the Western diet. This is an interesting area of research, is definitely the emulsifiers with carrageenan and maltodextrins, particularly in animal models, being associated with colitis. And in humans, definitely it shows that the carrageenan can actually thin the protective mucin layer, and that they've seen more invasion by pathogens in the gut enterocyte in association with using these different emulsifiers, particularly carrageenan. We had a visiting professor from University of Georgia at Hopkins, and he showed his own data where clearly and this is in animals though, but just giving carrageenan can show that you can have thinning of this protective mucus layer, and you can see the bacteria actually starting to encroach on the enterocyte. Kind of scary. And he talked about, Breyers at least doesn't have, carrageenan in it, so he kind of knew which ice creams did or didn't at the talk, because someone definitely had to ask about ice cream, given that it was in the early summertime. But in any event, again, we're looking at things in the diet. Gluten is, and at least in Ari's mind, was a driver. I showed you gluten in a slide or two earlier, or at least 3 or 4 slides earlier, as a question mark. But when Ari Levine designed a diet for Crohn's, he thought gluten was in play because there's so many people with gluten intolerances out there, particularly in the IBS community. This is Susan Dakota's work. She's at Cedar-Sinai Hospital in LA. And so what she did was she did an interesting study where she looked at genetic susceptibility in mice. So you have what's called an IL-10 knockout. IL-10 is a cytokine which helps protect us from a regulatory point of view and keeps us from going into this autoimmune inflammatory state. And so if you knock out the gene in mice and they have their microbiome intact, they can be susceptible to inflammatory bowel disease. Okay, so what she did was give these mice who have IL-10 knockouts milk fat, just garden variety, ordinary, non-grass-fed milk fat, omega-6 fatty acid-rich milk fat. And in the liver, it induced taurine-conjugated bile acids. And so what these taurine-conjugated bile acids did, to show you the interaction of the bile acids with the microbiome, it induced this pathogen called B. wadsworthia. And in this setting, B. wadsworthia activated the immune system, and in these genetically susceptible mice caused inflammatory bowel disease. So that's kind of the network that she showed, is that you can have a dietary component interact with your body or your liver and have bile acids that are conjugated, and those bile acids will induce a pathogen, and that pathogen in a genetically susceptible model can induce inflammatory bowel disease. And even was able to measure that the hydrogen sulfide was actually one of the induced agents that caused disruption. So here shows you a little bit of a model of what a high-fat diet can do. You can, in the back of your mind, say, supersize me, you deserve a break today and all that. But a high-fat diet has, it's a happy meal, but on your gut it's not so happy. And here are the things that I'm really into McDonald's this today, ain't I? High-fat diet can do is look what's happening here, this taurocolic acid that we mentioned from Dakota's work, right? So you have bile acids induced, more taurocolic acid, more of that hydrogen sulfide, and you know hydrogen sulfide is nasty on your gut. So you're inducing hydrogen sulfide, you're breaking down the gut barrier in the setting of a high-fat diet, you're inducing dysbiosis, and you're breaking down, again, the zonulin disassembly is occurring, you're breaking down the gut barrier, and you can imagine all the effects that occur just having a quote-unquote high-fat diet. So in summary, we have animal milk, animal products, byproducts, milk fat, iron, emulsifiers are known to flare IBD in these models. The high sugar diet, high fat diet I showed you from Susan's work can do it. It can have more severe ileitis. It can induce Th17 cells. The same with maltodextrin, right? I talked about how carrageenan can cause a loss of that protective mucin layer. Patrick talked about biofilms and how there's studies showing how maltodextrin can induce pathogenic biofilms, and certainly iron and red meat become an issue as well. So here we have emulsifiers, and that seems to be the hot topic on the block here, at least in our community. And so we can see in the animal models that we have more of these cytokines that are induced in the setting of giving emulsifiers to these individuals or these rats that have these animal models for IBD, which is quite unfortunate. So what we've done is summarize the diets, at least at this point in time, is that there's a whole host of literature and Cochrane reviews for enteral nutrition or drinks that can help control inflammatory bowel disease. So we know enteral nutrition and these nutritional drinks, both elemental drinks and these polymeric drinks, can be useful for inflammatory bowel disease, and it can help maintain remission as well. Elimination diets, although we didn't have enough in our review, our Cochrane review, to show benefit, but there are 7 out of 10 overall in the literature that may have not met our criterion, but actually showed there was improvement on elimination diets that Liz had gone through. The SCD diet, there is not really abundant evidence. There's a large study being conducted on it today. There are some studies on the low FODMAP diet, at least improving symptoms for inflammatory bowel disease, and needs further investigation. So let's look at a different point of view in terms of the diet. What about dietary polyphenols? Right, we talk about the anti-inflammatory diet, the Mediterranean diet. So we're looking at polyphenols in foods with polyphenols. So for those of you who had red wine last night, although I have to say at the bar last night, they were quite stingy in the allocation of that. As I was talking to Dan earlier today, and those who had dinner with me last night, I rarely order a second glass of wine. I'm really not a lush, but it was very good though. It was Malbec, but it could have been a little bit more volume-wise. In any event, at least I have my coffee today, right? In any event, so we do have polyphenols in a number of different foods and chocolates and certainly extra virgin olive oil, and they have different antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. And the more we take of this, remember I showed the tea earlier on as one of these protective risk factors through the MEGA meta-analysis. Certainly that'll decrease the risk. There was a cohort called the EPIC trial, and they've looked at these different polyphenols, and again, they will reduce the risk of Crohn's disease, and certainly that is really in play when you recommend it to your patients. You'll always have questions about wine and red wine consumption, and again, believe it or not, you think you're killing your microbiome, but at least in a very, I wouldn't say guarded amount, but at least in a healthy amount, which could be 1 to 2 drinks a day. The red wine can actually biodiversify, surprisingly, the microbiome. So what about white wine? Well, there is some suggestive study, but there's no other, if you look at spirits like bourbon. Did you have bourbon last night, Dan? You did? Why am I surprised? But anyway, but he likes that. Relax and have a little bourbon. That's okay. I need a little bit of that, probably watching the World Series, Diego, But that's why I need the second glass of wine. But in any event, but they don't find it in spirits at all to be any protective. So we do have in your toolkit, we do have polyphenols, a little handout for you, the foods that are rich in polyphenols to be helpful for you. Another dietary study, which is incredibly controversial. In fact, I saw the data presented at what's called the Freston Conference. Freston Conference is this annual conference put on by the AGA kind of after our Digestive Disease Week, which focuses on a very relevant area of research. And, there's a group of us who submitted a proposal for diet and GI disease. It sounds really intuitive to this audience, but there were 8 proposals for all different types of things, including stem cells and organoids and all kinds of scientific themes. And our proposal won, so we hosted the Freston Conference, myself and the AGA president, Sheila Crow, and the former ACG president, Bill Che. We had the Freston Conference. We had Jamie Lewis present some data, and he showed some data on red meat that I'm going to provide to you. And because this may be counterintuitive and different than the epidemiological study from the Nurses' Health Study, so coming in Digestive Disease Week this year in Chicago, we're going to have a debate between the people in Boston who did the Nurses' Health Study showing that red meat is so bad versus this study, which actually implies that maybe we got it wrong. But just realize that it's out there. I can't say I agree with the outcome or the message, but just realize that it's out there in the literature, is that they actually have a diet which looked at the role of processed and red meats and whether those restrictions make a difference. So they had 2 groups, obviously, a group that did restriction or had low consumption of the red and processed meats, and those who were liberalized or had no restrictions at all. And with the Kaplan-Meier curve that you see, there is no difference between the 2 groups when you talk about time to symptomatic relapse. And that's the end of that particular message. It's out there. We will see who wins the debate in May in Chicago. Any predictions? Diego, no? Who's going to win a debate? Should we ask your bookie what the odds are? Okay. He's sick of being picked on. I'll leave Diego alone. Okay. Anyway, so this is the results of their trial. And again, they're finding that there was no really relationship between red and processed meats, and you know my opinion on that. Okay. So it's interesting when you look at this, and this was published again in a different review by Jamie Lewis in 2019 of this year, and Gastroenterology, one of our society journals, is that just look at, if you look at these different diets, Ari Levine's diet, we'll talk about a little bit more, the Crohn's disease elimination diet, a CD treat diet, Mediterranean diet, anti-inflammatory diet, SCD, low FODMAP. There's certain things that are in common that I put in brackets that are allowed, that are kind of interesting. Lean meat, chicken, eggs, fruit, banana, apple. Certainly there's very little else to kind of put this all together, but there's certain things that they have in common that are kind of interesting. And it would be interesting if they had a diet with those things in common, what the outcome would be. But Ari Levine had said, hey, look, there's certain things if we take out the diet, I think people will do better. Okay? So wheat's up there. Patrick had spent a whole lecture on wheat and everything gluten, right? Dairy, animal fat, we know people have intolerances to these are common allergens, right? Dairy and wheat. You take people off dairy and wheat with IBS, a lot of people are going to get better for a number of reasons. But this is a little bit of a different disease. So he has carrageenan and maltodextrin as being one of the potential evils based on all the animal studies that are out there. So emulsifiers come off the list as a bad thing. And he adds more fruits and vegetables. It's intuitive to us, but actually Ari did the study, right? So it's a complicated study. It was done in children. It was done with individuals with mild, moderate disease. And it's a little bit of a complicated protocol where people get not only this more whole foods-based exclusion diet, but they get partial nutritional drinks. So you're trying to really give an oligoanogenic diet to the gut, so it really has to minimally process the food itself. So he has that. So there's really two groups, people who get this exclusion diet and people who do not. And people who do get over time, after 6 weeks, people who get, the nutritional drink as well. So the conclusions, it's complicated, but just focus on the conclusions, is that, if you get this partial enteral nutrition, which is PEN, it really helps to induce remission. So just think, bless you, we have, children are getting steroids, they're getting Remicade, they're getting all these things, but if you can treat children with nutrition first, wouldn't you think that's a better way to go? And we've known that for years because a lot of the studies in Japan and Canada, and they use that nutrition first in children, and this kind of showed that, and that was just exclusive enteral nutrition. This shows you can have a modified whole foods-based diet, take out some of the potential triggers, and you can do well just with diet alone. It's really, really a miraculous study. And again, it's a very powerful study that they're actually to maintain remission at 12 weeks and reduce inflammation. This shows you some of the metrics that were looked at. And you can see in blue is the Ari Levine's exclusion diet, or called CDED, and then in orange is just exclusive enteral nutrition. And so if you allow people to eat good whole foods and eliminate some of the potential triggers, they can do better than if you're just drinking your nutrition drinks alone. Very powerful information. But we know, and this slide or two will just kind of reiterate something we've known for many years, is that people do quite well, or children do well, on these partial and full enteral nutrition drinks. As you know, there's Boost, there's all kinds of drinks on the market. For many years, elemental diets were prescribed, and they're very hard to really assimilate, right? They're not palatable. They're very chalky and taste really awful. And realize is that when we talk about partial enteral nutrition, we're looking at 50% or so of the calories coming from formula. Okay, so I think I've talked about this already. Again, we're looking at the Mediterranean diet as probably the best way to go at this point in terms of adults, in terms of maintaining disease, and that's one of the larger studies that are out there in terms of looking at the anti-inflammatory approach to this disease. So what about reinoculation? We talked about diet and the role of diet. What about probiotics, prebiotics, short-chain fatty acids, and other? This shows that there's a yin-yang with this disease, and there are certain drivers and mitigators of the disease. And again, we have an imbalance with the key pathogenic species. We talked about balance in communities of bacteria. There's some key species that may drive the disease moving forward. Fecal bacterium prasinutski is one of those that they look at. Unfortunately, that may be a driver. And then certainly if you decrease your mucin-producing species like Akers meanii, that can perhaps put one at risk as well. This is incredibly complicated, but realize there's a number of ways by which the microbiome can mitigate this disease or drive the disease, and it provides opportunities for intervention. I'll just point out a few things on the slide where antibiotics, certainly we know, may disrupt the biome, become a driver. Emulsifiers may actually allow encroachment of pathogens towards the enterocyte, and they can be acting along with TLR4s that can actually cause an immune driving event. Fecal transplantation, there is limited data in both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease where that may be useful, but that's only on a research basis, and we'll talk about how the probiotics from an immunological and biodiversity point of view, again, they're passengers, but they can actually shape the immune response in this disease. So what about these probiotics that I had alluded to? They can do a number of things shown on this chart which may be beneficial. And again, here you can see how they can drive the immune response. They can increase the regulatory T cell functions and decrease the TNF and IL-12, which really drives the disease forward, and also promote healing and barrier integrity. These are all important features of probiotics and why they may be beneficial for inflammatory bowel disease. These slides shows you some of the controlled trials. Marty Flock had published this back in 2015. For Crohn's disease, the recommendation is that there are no studies, or actually there is a paucity of studies showing benefit. There were some studies on Saccharomyces boulardii which looked kind of interesting, but not enough to make a conclusion. Ulcerative colitis, there are a number of studies showing, at least for VSL3 and E. coli Nissl, and maybe for some others where it shows some benefit, particularly for pouchitis. So keep in mind if you have a patient with Crohn's, they may not be, at least by evidence, the best suitable candidate for probiotic. But with ulcerative colitis, there may be some benefit, particularly if they have acute UC, as shown in this slide. This is a study, although old, from 2005, showing that high-dose VSL3, I think it was 1.2 trillion per day they were receiving, can help achieve remission. And you can see here it's quite high. And those who were refractory to medical therapy received the VSL3, and look how well they did. So if you look at the systematic reviews by A.C. Ford, who is out at Leeds in the UK, who does a lot of these systematic reviews, really came up with really the one is VSL3 being really good for inducing remission for active UC, and that was the study that I just showed you that he highlights in his paper. And actually, in that case, VSL3 may be as important or as helpful as mesalamine. So that's how this probiotic can be used as a drug. What about short-chain fatty acids? Well, look at all that it can do here in terms of bolstering the mucus layer. It can actually improve integrity, inhibit NF-kappa B, which is a translation driver of inflammation, helps with repair, helps attenuate inflammation, helps reset regulatory T cells. So butyrate in particular is the one that we want to look at. But if you give prebiotics or you give butyrate enemas, you can actually directly influence the environment of the gut with increased short-chain fatty acids. There's been some randomized controlled trials of prebiotics in IBD for both Crohn's and UC. And again, there's not enough trials. And I would certainly consider, at least for UC, that we can add prebiotics and feel like we're making a difference, not by itself, but at least as part of the therapy. I think Patrick had already shown a slide much like this about what short-chain fatty acids can do and their benefits. And I had discussed this earlier, that short-chain fatty acids can do all these things, so I'll just move forward. So this is something that, before the era of biologics, we used more and more in the clinic, was that when we had people with left-sided disease that was refractory to, let's say, mesalamine enemas or steroid enemas, we would give short-chain fatty acid in the enema form and be able to use it as salvage therapy. because we know that these short-chain fatty acids can then help heal the inflamed mucosal lining and become very important anti-inflammatory therapies. So we've used that in the past, and it can be an effective salvage therapy. It's not used as much as it used to be because now of this top-down paradigm we've all been experiencing. So what about other interventions? What about omega-3 fatty acids? What about immunoglobulins? They may be useful. We talked about serum bovine-derived immunoglobulins yesterday and how they may help with healing, and they may help with barrier defense, they may help with dysbiosis, they may help with all these different factors bolstering immunity. Vitamin D, we'll show you some of that data. Curcumin, if there was one herb that you had to pick at high dose, it would be curcumin. I had a nice dinner with some good practitioners who were talking about how now they were using curcumin in the IV formulation, which I've never heard of, but it sounds quite interesting. But curcumin can be really magic for people with this condition, and L-glutamine is kind of one of our standards for repair. We'll show you a study where it was used for the colon, which is kind of paradoxical since we know that it's really used for more small bowel enterocytes. So this kind of, again, is like a little bit of a Venn diagram showing all the different things that nutrition may be doing in inflammatory bowel disease. In terms of like an Ari Levine study about antigenic load, we can diminish antigenic load, particularly with these Crohn's disease drinks, restore permeability, reset the immune or inflammatory drive, and of course mitigate dysbiosis. This is a clinical trial which looked at 1,200 IUs of vitamin D3 in a randomized controlled trial for individuals with Crohn's disease. You can see the Kaplan-Meier curve over time looks at people in terms of remission. So we look to see who is actually in remission at the end of the trial period during the 12 months. And you can see here that there's only a 0.06 is the p-value, which is non-significant, but there was a strong trend. And the individuals with vitamin D3 did better, right? The percentage of patients who reached their primary endpoint was nearly significant compared to placebo. So that kind of gives us hope that if we give at least 1,200 units, there's other studies looking at repletion based on the level of 25-hydroxy-D. There's other studies looking at higher doses, but you're seeing more and more people look at vitamin D3. And actually, Berkeley, Lynn McKay is finishing a Cochrane review for vitamin D in inflammatory bowel disease, and he's working with some other investigators from Hopkins, finishing that up from his PhD work. But in any event, we know that we have some modulation of the arachidonic acid cascade from a pharmaceutical point of view, but also from a nutraceutical point of view as well, that you will see curcumin and boswellia pop up all along this pathway. So we know that we can modulate arachidonic acid, which is one of the primary mediators for inflammatory bowel disease. We can mitigate that by using some of these natural products or nutraceuticals. We know that there's a number of studies, the Nurses' Health Study in Boston, the EPIC study, and even a sub-study showing that we do have an association that if you are high in omega-6 or low in omega-3, these are risk factors for inflammatory bowel disease. Not surprising, is it? So we know all about glutamine here in the audience, that it's used by enterocytes in the small bowel, and that if you put somebody on TPN and you deprive them of enteral glutamine, that they will start to break down their gut barrier. Okay, and there is the data to show that. That data is kind of old. And we know in Crohn's disease that the level of glutamine is low. So repletion is something that we ought to aim for in our populations. But this is interesting. This is looking at UC, which is a colonic disease, and giving glutamine, which is really meant for the small bowel. And what they shown was that people improved on glutamine in the colon, which is really paradoxical. Here are the dosages. I mean, you're going to see the different nutraceutical agents that'll be available in your toolkit in terms of here, but I just want to show you that we tend to start low and aim high with glutamine. This study, the formulation you may hear about in Europe is called Mullin. How many of you here have heard of Mullin? It's used mainly in Europe, came out a number of years ago in the US, didn't have a great market. It's a nutritional drink, which is used a lot for children, and it's been shown to help induce Crohn's disease. And you can see, we try to enrich the TGF-beta. TGF-beta is a regulatory cytokine, so the idea is that the TGF-beta helps reset the regulatory network, which helps control the inflammation. And you can see when people go on this Mullin drink, they control these inflammation, the inflammatory markers go low, and then their the Crohn's disease activity index goes low as well. So there's 3 studies showing efficacy. It's a popular, it's by Nestle, it's out in Europe, not really available out here, unfortunately, for reasons that I was told. It's just there wasn't a great market for it. There's a better market out there. And Nestle, their headquarters is in Switzerland, as you know. So here are the doses for the different nutraceuticals that I've been talking about and will talk about. So it's in your slides, it's also in your toolkit. So I'll just mention that and move on in the interest of time. More doses. Again, with glutamine, as I mentioned before, we aim low. We start at 2 to 4. We aim between 10 and 30 overall. And this is 5 to 10, beginning at QD and then TID. Arabinogalactans, serum-derived immunoglobulins. I start out with 5 grams and go up to 5 BID as needed. And then again, the whey protein with concentrated immunoglobulins can be used as well, and that's actually one of the key ingredients in Mullin. So you don't need to get the Mullin, you can't get it in this country, you can use whey-derived immunoglobulins, because that's really the key ingredient in that drink. So what about, this is a nice little summary for you, shows you the summary of dietary supplements showing evidence. There is really good studies for curcumin, both in the maintenance and induction of disease. 2 studies out in Japan, 1 in the US. Boswellia shows non-inferiority to mesalamine 6-MP combination. So Boswellia may be something for induction of disease as an adjunct. Omega-3 fatty acids is controversial. There's been several studies. There's probably been more meta-analyses than studies out there, and it's controversial because the largest study was negative. It was a US-Canadian study that was negative. But there's smaller studies that show positivity. But the 3 studies for UC showed induction, and that was pretty clear. But the CD studies are a little more controversial. But I personally don't see a downside to using it, quite honestly. In fact, if you look at the next row down, it says UCNS. Doug Snyder, who is at Vanderbilt, I believe, he had moved from Cleveland Clinic to Vanderbilt. And he developed this drink in collaboration with Abbott Labs. And they developed this drink which had prebiotics, antioxidants, and fish oil. And they're able to wean people off steroids with UC, and actually they started to apply it for people with Crohn's disease, and they showed significant improvement just on the drink. So given that omega-3s are one of the principal components of the drink, it shows you in real time if you have how these nutraceuticals interact and synergize. It just makes sense that you really shouldn't be looking at these nutraceuticals in an isolated manner and say yay or nay. Things kind of work in biology. Things work in tandem, and they work together, and they work as a team. And that's how we should kind of view them. But in our reductionistic society, we tend to look things in isolation. And that's, and that's why Ari Levine's diet was really interesting. He had a number of things in his diet. He just didn't take out gluten or dairy. He took out gluten, dairy, carrageenan, and maltodextrin, and he added fruits and vegetables. And it's not surprising he has such a good outcome, right? I mean, we're looking at the way things work together in biology. And I showed you some of the studies with butyrate. The enema studies are kind of old, but the oral studies are kind of newer. And actually, the oral studies are kind of interesting. If you can have, and you have vendors next door who actually sell that, if you have a sustained release butyrate product and you can get it into the colon without having significant breakdown in the small bowel, you can actually make a difference. And there's studies to show that, so we need more studies like that. The vitamin D that Berkeley is doing the meta-analysis on showed mixed results, but the fact that there are some which show positivity with induction and with maintenance are kind of interesting. So it doesn't hurt to really at least have vitamin D to sufficiency, but we don't have a message saying what's the best way to do, what's the best dose. It's probably individualized, and certainly leaving somebody vitamin D deficient in the setting of Crohn's disease is a no-no, at least in my mind, and the evidence would support that. Other things that may be interesting includes wormwood towards the bottom, because Patrick had mentioned that yesterday, because it definitely has antimicrobial and immunoregulatory capacity. The one above that shows UC is from the German group, which put together this enema form, which has aloe and wheatgrass and myrrh and frankincense and gold and whatever. I mean, that was supposed to be a joke, but I'm glad you all picked up on that. I didn't mean that. I'm not going to tell you to put gold at $15.04 an ounce, at least on the mercantile exchange. But you would want to definitely, just keep the ingredients here: charcoal enema, chamomile. But he showed induction of remission in UC that was refractory to medical therapy, and this is what he does in his clinic out in Germany. And again, Andrew Graffis has some data, but there's only 2 studies. So realize that these are, if your patients are taking some of these, they are definitely options and in play, but the wormwood to me is kind of interesting. Alrighty. So this is from my colleague, Joost Langhorst, and he put together this systematic review, which you should all take a look at. He did a nice job. And he looked at curcumin in particular, and prebiotics as one way to really help with inflammatory bowel disease. He thought wormwood, like I do, is kind of interesting. But also he looked at the mind-body relationship, which is kind of unusual. We talk about all these biological interventions. But what about the mind-body stress relationship, that big N in the dig-in, that we've kind of neglected during our discussion? So it's Halloween coming up. We had to show something orange. What about worms? That was candy, by the way, I would hope. But she looked happy. So what about this relationship? So it's about the hygiene hypothesis that Patrick had eloquently discussed, and how that in areas of the world, like India, we don't see much IBD, but we do see, that people harbor certain parasites, and it's because these parasites in particular may not only biodiversify the gut, but they induce T regulatory cells and a Th2 response, because Th2 responses keep us out of inflammation, but they can also promote allergy. So there's different animal models that have been looked at using helminths as therapy. You've all heard about individual clinical trials that are out there. I'll show you 2 really quickly in the interest of time. Is that when it was looked at, and this was Dave Elliott, who used to be a chief resident at Hopkins years ago before he went to University of Iowa and worked with Joel Weinstock. And they did this trial where they looked at certainly these worms, and he looked at in blue the people who dropped their Crohn's disease activity index. So they had a response. In red shows that there's a further response, and in green shows they went in remission. So these can actually induce the Th2 network in Crohn's and show that they actually can lower the state of autoimmunity and improve symptoms. Low-dose naltrexone is used pretty commonly in the community, and in Crohn's disease there is one study out of Hershey which showed improvement with low-dose naltrexone, and it's used by many practitioners off-label, so I want to show you at least there's one study to support that, but not others that I could find. So for this, in wrapping it up here, what is the 5R treatment plan? It is, again, we're reiterating the summary of the presentation. You've seen this before. Again, the intervention was a little bit of a modified elimination diet, anti-inflammatory medical food, some botanicals for her dysbiosis, and of course mind-body relaxation, because the stress was a principal driver. So once she got a little bit more balance in her life and had a good diet, she started to improve, her weight came up. So again, this is just to summarize that IBD is a very complicated inflammatory disease that has many antecedents, drivers, and certainly triggers, and therefore we should think about strategies that include, taken together, all the tools that we are speaking about today. We should try to biodiversify the microbiome, optimize vitamin D status, and then I think down the road, omics. Well, we're not there yet, but I think omics will certainly help us further. So with that, I'm going to finish with just a quick vignette. Is that okay, Dan? Just have this quick vignette because basically, we talk about inflammatory disease or fire in the gut, but diverticulitis is quite common, right? How many here have a loved one, relative, patient that they've seen with diverticulitis? It can be, quite painful. But this is someone who's pretty young. I see people much younger, though, who have it. I have patients 24, 25 who have diverticulitis. So 41 is not so young for this disease, at least that I see. But again, what's interesting is that when she was in the office the first time, she was not a patient. She was like with her husband, who had diverticulitis and wound up needing a more urgent resection. And so, unfortunately, this flared her disease. So then she became the patient. It's kind of interesting. But when you look at the tease through a history, long history of antibiotic use for recurrent diverticulitis, and she comes in with a flare, history of migraines, fatigue, otherwise unremarkable. Accompanied in the clinic with her husband, who was at that point post-operative, married with 2 children, and again, she had quite tenderness in the left lower quadrant where you would expect in the sigmoid region. CAT scan minus some help from, we usually have a radiologist who can point out that there's not only thickening, shown here, but there's a fluid collection that is gathering and really indicates that she's got quite significant inflammatory disease. But this is just more informative because we don't talk about diverticulosis or itis in this population, but I usually see males present at a younger age. It's interesting that the older we get, the more risk it is for developing. So at the age of 80, 65% of adults actually have it. It's probably the most common, quote unquote, next to hemorrhoids, the most common GI disease or ICD-10 that we have. So listing the risk factors up and down, just realize low fiber diet is a risk factor. No matter what you hear, no matter what they say or whatever makes a soundbite or a tweet, that's what that is a fact. Physical activity, obesity, these are all modifiable lifestyle factors that certainly if you develop diverticuli by the time you're 60 or 70, you can't reverse that. But while you're young, this is the time to start thinking about these things. Okay, risk factors, if you have a healthy weight, you lower the red meat intake, take enough fiber, exercise, don't smoke, you will definitely lower your risk of developing diverticular disease. What are the modifiable influences or the mediators of disease? You can see it a little bit in green. It may be a little more difficult to see, but certainly diet, activity, the microbiome is definitely a modifier, as well as medications like NSAIDs can promote this. I have people who take NSAIDs for diverticulitis and they're actually making the condition worse. Okay, so we know that patients present with fever, abdominal pain, tenderness, CAT scan shows a disease. Unfortunately, in the acute setting, depending on the level of severity, people would need antibiotics. But it's interesting that there is literature showing that if you omit, or withhold antibiotics for very mild cases, people can still do well in that setting. So just keep that in mind, that if you have complicated diverticulitis, like with this lady who's got this, pelvic fluid collection that's developing, you have to go ahead and control the dysbiotic microbiome. But if it's mild, then you can focus on anti-inflammatory regimens and actually rebalance the microbiome. So there is a systematic review, which, I like to present these kind of systematic reviews. And here it shows that if you can liberalize the diet and biodiversify the diet, people can actually do better. Because in the setting of diverticulitis, people tend to withhold fiber because that is felt to be an irritant and a promoter of disease, and that may not be the way to go, and certainly the literature supports that. This shows you some more data by Ma and colleagues looking at the intake of dietary fiber. And here the focus was, it was more about the cereal fibers and the fibers from fruits that shows a decreased risk factor, but I would just say that all fiber would be good. But this particular study focused on the fiber from cereals and fruits. So here, again, we're looking at microbial balance or imbalance in promoting diverticulitis. I have a sister-in-law who drinks kefir now for this and hasn't had a flare in years. She drinks kefir every morning and swears by it. And her husband, my brother, swears at it. But he can't deal with it. So she got him to do a yogurt drink. And so I thought that was a milestone, that he actually, I won't say the brand, but it probably got too much sugar in it, but that he can deal with. But she's more like myself. Like I can't, when I visit them in Port St. Lucie, I was telling Joel about the other day, we should do a Met game down there during the springtime or in March, is that we'll go down there, they'll have that kefir, and I'll say, okay, where's mine? Barb will say, okay, here's our kefir, and Tim will sit there and say, oh, what are you guys doing? Give me my yogurt drink. But in any event, but prebiotics, probiotics, these are all in play. You want to restore the microbiome in the setting of diverticulitis. So in this situation, yeah, she had the fluid collection. She was started by the PCP anyway, continued the antibiotic mesalamine because there's evidence showing for diverticulitis that may be useful. And again, we put her on organic kefir. And there is some evidence about probiotics, but not enough evidence about probiotics and diverticulitis. But I've seen other patients besides my own family do well with that. So again, we want to keep calm and put out the fire in the gut. And I look forward to the Q&A session with you. Thank you.